August 1945. The war was ending, though no one in the hills of northern Luzon yet believed it. Inside a low bamboo building that smelled of smoke, antiseptic and rain-soaked fabric, the ceiling fans barely turned. On cots along each wall lay the wounded of a vanished army. Japanese nurses, clerks, and women's army officers who had survived retreat, malaria, and gunfire. Their uniforms were ragged yet still buttoned to the throat. Discipline clung where empire had fallen. When the door opened, the sound was not Japanese boots but American ones. Men entered carrying tin basins and morphine kits. They spoke in calm, practical tones as they changed bandages. The women's eyes followed every movement, stiff with confusion. It was unthinkable, men and foreigners, filling the most intimate role in the world they had been taught to guard, that of nurse. Outside, monsoon clouds slid over the mountains, muffling the echoes of distant artillery. Inside, a single act of kindness crossed centuries of separation. Pride met mercy in silence, and something fragile began to break. To understand the weight of that moment in the humid stillness of 1945, we must return to the years that forged these women and the empire they served. If history like this fascinates you, the forgotten truths, then make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell icon. Decades before those women found themselves in foreign care, they had been shaped by a nation that saw duty as purity itself. In the Japan of the 1930s, a woman's place was sanctified through two ideals: Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother, and Yamato Nadeshiko, the poetic image of feminine virtue, silent strength, endurance, devotion. Her loyalty was first to family, then to emperor. Politics and war were the domain of men, but as Japan's militarism expanded across Asia, this strict separation began to blur. The empire needed every resource, including its women. By the time imperial troops marched into China in 1937, female students were already sewing uniforms, rolling bandages, and drilling in hygienic training institutes. The government created the Dai Nippon Ikoku Fuji Kai, the Greater Japan Women's Patriotic Association, to organize them. They learned to bow not to individual patients but to the nation's destiny. When total war tightened its grip, volunteer nursing became near compulsory. University graduates joined the Women's Volunteer Nursing Corps. Younger girls filled Red Cross classes that emphasized endurance under hardship. They studied anatomy alongside imperial rescripts that glorified sacrifice. Their training films showed loyal nurses smiling as bombs fell. Women were told they were the shield behind the sword. By the early 1940s, more than 50,000 women served directly with the army in hospitals stretching from Manchuria to Malaya. Many were designated officers in the Women's Army Nursing Service, others attached to the Navy's Auxiliary Corps. All swore oaths to the emperor. They wore khaki, carried identification discs, and saluted commanding officers, though their task was to preserve life rather than take it. Their treatment facilities reflected the Insul-like order of Japan's wartime ideals. Male doctors led, female nurses executed. Contact between genders was closely controlled, a reflection of both Confucian hierarchy and military propriety. In field hospitals near Shanghai or Rangoon, canvas screens divided male patients from female caregivers. Modesty was discipline. Distance was honor. When war spilled into the Pacific, these doctrines traveled with them. In the Philippines campaign of 1942, Japanese women arrived as part of medical detachments attached to the 14th Army. Some tended wounded during the brutal siege of Bataan. Others managed sanitation units. Local civilians watched in curiosity and fear. Japanese women officers were a rarity, their composure almost unnatural amid ruin. To those women, nursing was spiritual warfare. They treated and comforted the wounded with the same solemnity others reserved for shrines. Death was inevitable, but to die dutifully under the flag was transcendence. As the conflict widened, Japan's leaders pushed these ideals harder. Magazines published illustrations of smiling nurses attending soldiers under cherry blossoms, captioned, "Even in pain we serve the emperor with joy." Few readers saw the mud, the infection, the exhaustion behind that propaganda. By 1943, Japan's fronts were shrinking, casualties rising beyond imagination. To fill hospitals, the regime mobilized students in medicine and midwifery. Female doctors, still a minority, were drafted into service. The Women's Volunteer Corps, once limited to home defense and factory work, began training for battlefield nursing. Among them were young women who would later find themselves stranded in tropical hospitals thousands of kilometers from home. They were raised in obedience but confronted with chaos. Isolation hardened them. Ideology became their only compass. Correspondence censorship kept them insulated from outside thought. They believed the homeland still triumphant, even as Allied submarines strangled its supply lines. By the final years of war, the sight of Japanese women in uniform had become common in Southeast Asia. They followed units retreating through Burma's jungles and the Philippines' mountain passes. Tending to soldiers dying from disease and hunger, their loyalty remained absolute. An empire's devotion distilled into human endurance. Yet this sense of purity carried within it a fatal weakness. It assumed defeat was impossible, captivity shameful beyond life. Official manuals stated plainly that surrender was a stain no woman should bear. Better suicide than dishonor. So when the tides finally turned, and the hospitals themselves became encircled battlefields, their education offered no guidance for survival. The world that had defined them, obedient daughters of divine empire, was collapsing at the edges. To see how duty turned into disorientation, we must follow those doctrines into their final test. Japan's shrinking perimeter in 1944 and 1945, when its women were drafted not in theory but in desperate reality. By 1944, Japan's dream of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was dissolving under the weight of blockade and bombardment. In desperation, the government ordered full mobilization of its population. The home islands instituted the Women's Volunteer Labor Corps. Overseas nursing detachments swelled with hastily trained recruits. Patriotic rhetoric cloaked exhaustion. Young women who had once organized school drives now stood beside frontline surgeons in makeshift operating rooms. That final phase reached its brutal zenith in the Philippines. When American forces landed on Leyte in October 1944, Japan's 14th Area Army suddenly found itself without supply or evacuation routes. Tens of thousands of Japanese troops, including medical staff and female auxiliaries, were cut off. The women of the Army Nursing Service received orders that spoke of unbroken devotion. In practical terms, it meant no retreat. Through the winter of 1945, the Battle of Manila destroyed the capital in a storm of artillery fire. Field hospitals collapsed beneath walls of rubble. In the chaos, Japanese nurses treated both soldiers and civilians with dwindling supplies. Some used the last morphine to ease their patients' deaths rather than their suffering. Reports later found in archives describe medical orderlies boiling bandages for reuse, operating by candlelight, praying quietly as bombs shook the ground. As the front lines disintegrated, small groups withdrew into the highlands of Luzon. Among them were detachments of the Japanese Army Nursing Service and the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, a mixture of trained officers and volunteers. Their duty, they were told, was to remain with the wounded to the end. They erected bamboo huts as wards, used rainwater for cleaning, and survived on rice stolen from abandoned villages. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence was tracking Japanese medical remnants. American combat medics and Filipino guerrillas encountered the wreckage of hospitals, piles of splints, handwritten ledgers, torn curtains marked with the red sun emblem. For them, the existence of Japanese women in uniform was unusual enough to warrant photographs. Yet the reality was grimmer. They were starving, surrounded, and still unwilling to surrender. In March 1945, as the Battle of Iwo Jima concluded far to the north, Allied forces in Luzon pushed into the mountains. Entire Japanese units dissolved into scattered resistance cells. Communication with Tokyo ceased. What remained of medical personnel functioned autonomously. Cognizant of Japan's code against capture, U.S. psychological warfare teams prepared leaflets promising humane treatment for those who surrendered. Very few women saw them. Even fewer believed them. By midsummer, Japan itself lay under aerial siege. Everyday B-29 raids flattened more of the homeland. The Emperor's army in the Philippines fought on, officially abandoned but loyal to an idea rather than an order. When the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki 3 days later, the isolated outposts knew little. Radio intercepts carried only fragments of news, rumors of annihilation, whispered disbelief. Then on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice addressed his people for the first time in history. The message reached Luzon through a crackling shortwave broadcast captured by a U.S. signal unit. Interpreters passed the essence to prisoners and stragglers alike. The war has ended. Lay down your arms. For the Japanese women hiding in mountain hospitals, the implications were inconceivable. To lay down arms meant surrender. To surrender meant shame beyond life. Some contemplated self-harm. Others simply sat in silence, unable to reconcile devotion with survival. In the days that followed, guerrilla patrols discovered wounded Japanese, men and women alike too weak to resist. U.S. officers, aware of Japanese fears about captivity, ordered their medical teams to treat all wounded impartially. Among those evacuations were the first groups of Japanese women officers seen by American soldiers. They were gaunt, feverish, and incredulous that mercy was extended instead of retribution. What awaited them was both rescue and revelation. U.S. Army medics, guided by field manuals and humanitarian pragmatism, established treatment camps for Japanese prisoners. Medical staff included male orderlies and nurses, a normal sight for Americans, but shockingly foreign to these women raised under rigid codes of propriety. Thus began an encounter unlike any other in the war. Women who had embodied Imperial Japan's most sacred traditions of purity and separation were suddenly patients in wards managed by male foreigners. The inversion was profound, a clash not of weapons but of worlds. Within those quiet hospital tents, cultural certainties unraveled faster than empires. To grasp the full meaning of that confrontation, we must look through several angles: human, medical, cultural, and moral, to see what each side understood, and what none could forget. The women who arrived at Allied medical stations in late 1945 were symbols of Japan's vanished confidence. Many were in their 20s, some barely older than the soldiers they had tended. Their khaki uniforms hung loose from malnutrition. Their insignia, though frayed, still displayed the cherry blossom emblem of the Imperial Army Nursing Service. They carried themselves with the rigidity of officers, even on stretchers. For them, being touched by a man outside of marriage or surgical necessity had once been unthinkable. Yet here, American hospital tents blurred every distinction. Male medics administered injections, changed dressings, fed patients with spoons. Eyewitnesses from the U.S. 41st Field Hospital described the mixture of gratitude and visible discomfort from their new patients. They saluted even when we gave them medicine, one medical sergeant recalled. They didn't know how to stop being soldiers. Cultural dissonance was compounded by exhaustion. Many of the women had worked through malaria, dysentery, and starvation before capture. Some were stunned by the abundance of Allied supplies: clean sheets, anesthesia, rice porridge. One nurse asked through an interpreter if she had died and awakened in an enemy's hospital in heaven. To witness kindness where they expected humiliation forced a quiet reevaluation of everything they had been taught. American reports note that discipline remained ingrained even among the bedridden. When an orderly brushed aside a muddy blanket, a Japanese officer tried to apologize formally for the soiled fabric. The U.S. staff gently laughed and reassured her, but the gesture symbolized a hierarchy that had collapsed only on paper. For some patients, the emotional collision broke through their restraint. Allied nurses recalled tears without sound, a slow recognition that survival itself was acceptable. Captivity, they discovered, did not necessarily mean dishonor. It meant continuance, and that was a revelation more shattering than defeat. The hospitals that received Japanese prisoners in the Philippines were not designed for reconciliation. They were instruments of logistics. Mobile field units moved relentlessly behind the front, stitching bodies regardless of nationality. Yet they became laboratories of unexpected empathy. Standard U.S. Army Medical Department procedure in 1945 mandated equal treatment of enemy wounded in accordance with the 1929 Geneva Convention. American doctors and male nurses followed these rules with methodical precision. They sterilized instruments, logged patient names, issued identification tags, all tasks alien to Japanese record-keeping, which often erased women from official rosters entirely. For wounded Japanese women, the experience of being treated by male professionals subverted two systems at once: the imperial code that forbade such intimacy, and the Allied assumption that all female prisoners were non-combatants. These women were both patients and officers, and their care required careful documentation. Some refused painkillers until superior officers permitted them. Others tried to salute doctors mid-procedure. Medical notes from the 37th Evacuation Hospital detail the conditions. Most cases involved tropical disease, malnutrition, shrapnel wounds. The American teams recorded astonishment at the patient's resilience. Constant fever, yet minimal complaint. Inspection drills continued from hospital beds. For the U.S. medical personnel, discipline in suffering was both admirable and unnerving. Male orderlies accustomed to boisterous convalescence found themselves working in near monastic silence. They lay still like statues, one wrote, as if movement itself would betray weakness. Despite unspoken distance, small exchanges bridged the divide. An American medic pointed to his Red Cross armband and said simply, "Same work, different flag." The women understood enough English to grasp it. They bowed faintly. Such wordless acknowledgments became the vocabulary of coexistence, fragments of shared professionalism amid the residue of war. The presence of male nurses underscored a further contrast between militaries. Whereas American field medicine had long accepted men in nursing roles, emphasizing skill over gender, Japan regarded nursing as an extension of womanly moral duty. The Japanese word kangofu, female nurse, had no equivalent masculine form in common usage. Seeing men perform that function inverted an entire linguistic and cultural schema. For historians, the records of these wards show the start of a modern Japanese awakening. The idea that service and compassion are not bound by gender or national ideology. In those wards, between ether and antibiotics, lay the blueprint for Japan's post-war nursing reforms. Technicians and patients coexisted within that fragile truce of necessity. But beyond the bodily repairs and formal politeness, the encounter reached deeper, into questions of identity, culture, and the meaning of shame and defeat. To see how both sides understood the phenomenon, we must step back and examine the broader cultural and moral angles that framed it. To a Japanese woman officer in 1945, propriety was armor. Her duties had been defined by an invisible wall, between men and women, between public and private, between self and state. Everything in her upbringing emphasized separation and discipline. Yet the Allied wards blurred each boundary with almost careless ease. American military hospitals were pragmatic spaces, not ceremonial ones. Men and women worked side by side. Nurses might joke with doctors. Orderlies might sing to patients. The unspoken democratic informality of the Allied environment was so alien that Japanese patients mistook it for irreverence. One interpreter described a nurse whispering, "They speak to officers like equals." For the Americans, equal treatment was professionalism. For the Japanese, it was disorientation. These women had been taught that intimacy outside marriage was shameful, that the presence of a male caregiver violated modesty. Yet here, cleanliness and compassion outweighed ritual. The smell of disinfectant and the crisp sound of gloves snapping replaced incense and formality. Gradually, small gestures softened that culture shock. A male orderly turning away discreetly to grant privacy during bandage changes. A Japanese patient bowing weakly in gratitude. It was civilization meeting itself in an unexpected mirror, two versions of duty discovering they were not opposites at all. These moments were not dramatic, but they were profound. They hinted at a Japan that would soon learn to separate respect from repression, and a West that would glimpse the stoic grace of its former enemy. Culture, stripped of propaganda, reduced to two people on opposite sides of a hospital bed, sharing the simplest human exchange. Care received, care given. Even as these quiet scenes unfolded, higher command viewed them through an administrative lens. General Douglas MacArthur's occupation policy meticulously codified the treatment of all Japanese prisoners, female or male. His orders to medical units emphasized decency, knowing any abuse could damage the fragile legitimacy of the Allied mission. For American leadership, mercy had become strategy. In contrast, surviving Japanese commanders struggled with what to tell Tokyo, or what remained of it, about their captured female personnel. Officially, such captives did not exist. Japanese military codes forbade surrender, and thus offered no guidance for the rehabilitation of women who had done so. Their records were quietly destroyed or rewritten to list them as missing. This top-down silence forced the individual nurses and women officers to navigate their own moral terrain. No superior would absolve them. No emperor would recognize their endurance. Yet ironically, their professionalism under foreign care earned respect from their former enemies. Allied doctors frequently recorded their patients' composure as exceptional, comparing it to that of American flight nurses under stress. By the time of repatriation months later, the policy paradox had produced two histories: official Japan clinging to myths of inviolable purity, and human Japan awakening to its shared vulnerability. The leadership vacuum became the birthplace of introspection. In every war, the victor confronts a quieter challenge after the guns fall silent: what to do with compassion. For those Allied medics, extending care to Japan's women officers tested that very principle. They treated injuries once sustained in defense of an empire that would have shown them no reciprocal mercy, yet professional ethics held firm. A U.S. chaplain writing home from Luzon described watching a Mustang overhead, and, beneath it, a tent where an American nurse helped a frail Japanese woman drink water. "This," he wrote, "is the moment the war truly ends, when hands that killed begin to heal." For the Japanese women, the encounter forced the redefinition of honor. Dying nobly had been considered duty. Living humbly now required greater courage. To accept care from a man, from an enemy, required them to dismantle decades of ideology within days. The moral landscape of those hospitals was thus a meeting of two forms of faith: Western humanitarianism and Eastern stoicism, each finding truth in the other's endurance. What emerged was a fragile reconciliation expressed not in treaties but in touch, gaze, and silence. Historians studying these episodes often call them the unspoken peace. Unlike parades or proclamations, this peace unfolded in whispers: the hiss of boiling instruments, the rustle of clean sheets, the translation of a thank you across languages. By the time ships arrived months later to return the women to Japan, the shock had faded into reflection. The arrogance of purity had melted into something gentler: comprehension that compassion does not humiliate. It equalizes. And it was this new equilibrium, born not in conference halls but in field hospitals, that colored Japan's immediate post-surrender months. As the formal surrender ceremony approached in early September, these women, now convalescent witnesses, would find themselves listening to the emperor's final words and watching history close over their own recovery wards. September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo. Bay shimmered under a pale haze as the ink dried on the instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri. Yet far from that ceremony, across hundreds of makeshift hospitals and prison camps scattered through Southeast Asia, the news arrived not as fanfare, but as whispered translation. "The fighting is over," interpreters told the wards. "Japan has surrendered." For the Japanese women officers lying beneath mosquito nets in Luzon or Borneo, the words seemed weightless at first. Surrender was an abstraction in imperial doctrine, a concept with no emotional vocabulary attached. Some stared blankly. Others covered their faces. They had been the empire's caretakers, its moral guardians. Now, by its own decree, the empire no longer existed. An American medic at the 102nd Evacuation Hospital noted in his diary, "They did not cheer, they did not speak." One woman pressed her forehead to her blanket as though praying. He understood later that this silence was the sound of a lifetime's ideology collapsing, quietly inside each of them. Hours turned into days as the reality of defeat bled into routine. The male orderlies continued changing dressings. The female Allied nurses handled translation, learning fragments of Japanese words for pain, water, thank you. Formal ranks dissolved until only practical cooperation remained. A few of the Japanese officers began assisting with duties, handing out supplies, organizing cleanliness, guiding weaker patients to therapy exercises. Survival required participation, and participation required acceptance. The decisive change was internal. Witnesses described the moment as if a collective exhale passed through the wards, a physical surrender after the political one. Female officers who once refused food from men began taking it without hesitation. Wounds once hidden behind layered modesty were examined openly by male physicians. At first, shame flushed their faces. Soon, pragmatism replaced embarrassment. Pain respected neither ideology nor gender. For the Americans, these gestures signified progress. For the Japanese, they were extraordinary acts of courage. Every small acquiescence, drinking from an offered cup, thanking a man for bandaging a wound, became rebellion against teachings of a lifetime. Yet it also carried liberation. In late September, an American photographer captured a rare image, a group of Japanese female nurses smiling faintly as an American Navy medic distributed fruit cans to them. To Western audiences, the picture looked like ordinary relief work. To anyone who understood imperial culture, it bordered on revolutionary. The image traveled through Stars and Stripes and later Japanese occupation papers, quietly contradicting years of propaganda. Back in Japan, word spread through incoming repatriation records that captured nurses were alive and being treated humanely. These reports, initially muted, undermined the moral foundation of militarist myth. If the enemy could behave with compassion, what did that say about the righteousness of Japan's sacrifice? In the hospitals, different forms of humanity persisted. A U.S. doctor caught influenza from a Japanese patient and was tended in turn by her companions. The boundaries blurred until enemy lost meaning in the wards. Death still occurred, disease, infection, but burials were shared acts. Americans reading psalms beside Buddhist chants. Both languages carried by the wind out over the mountains. That cooperation heralded a broader transformation waiting beyond the tents. When those women eventually boarded repatriation ships, many carried notebooks from Allied medical officers containing instructions on nutrition and wound care, the same techniques they would later use to rebuild Japan's public health system. What began as helpless patienthood had turned into apprenticeship. But in that moment, September to October 1945, the larger significance lay in the dawning awareness. The war had ended, yet a new world was forming in every small kindness exchanged across bandage and tray. The female officers who once guarded their virtue against foreign gaze were now living proof that dignity could coexist with vulnerability. Like the crackle of the Emperor's broadcast earlier that month, the sound within those wards was faint yet irreversible. The old Japan of hierarchy, modesty, and imperial certitude had fractured. In its place grew something quieter, a recognition that compassion, even from an enemy, was not degradation but deliverance. And as occupation forces organized Japan's surrender zones, that revelation would soon translate into policy and reconstruction. The experience of those field wards would echo in the new hospitals rising from Tokyo's ruins, where the symbolism of men and women, conqueror and conquered, would shift forever. October 1945. Manila's harbor was lined with white hospital ships, their hulls streaked with the rust of endless rescues. On the docks, stretchers and lifeboats traded burden and relief, Allied wounded heading home, Japanese prisoners of war boarding vessels for internment and repatriation. Among them moved the silent figures of Japanese women in faded khaki, escorted not by guard battalions, but by the very medics who had once treated them. It was an image none could have imagined a year earlier. Former enemies walking shoulder to shoulder down gangplanks, united by exhaustion more than politics. The transformation was not proclaimed. It was lived. A few days before departure, in a tent ward outside Lingayen Gulf, a group of American nurses and male orderlies prepared their final patients for the trip. Records describe Japanese women officers assisting willingly, helping to fold blankets, cleaning instruments, even spelling English labels onto supply crates. What had started as reluctant cooperation became simple camaraderie. A U.S. surgeon later wrote, "We discovered no mystery to them. They wanted the same thing we did, an end." Each side carried its own private astonishment. The American medical service saw discipline where it had expected fanaticism. The Japanese women found gentleness where they had expected disgrace. It was the precise inversion of wartime propaganda. Their shared space became an accidental classroom in mutual disillusionment, each party learning what the other had never been allowed to believe. In the larger framework of the war's end, these hospital wards mirrored the re-education of an entire nation. As occupation troops stepped onto Japanese soil that same month, General MacArthur's Supreme Command for the Allied powers broadcast his policy: disarm the military, democratize society, and protect the rights of women. The irony could not have been greater. The first cultural rehearsal for those reforms had already played out in the Pacific's temporary hospitals. Those who had witnessed the care given to Japanese prisoners wrote of a different kind of triumph, not of conquest but of method. Mercy had done what combat could not. It dissolved the last emotional resistance. U.S. medical photographs circulated through Tokyo's newspapers during the first months of occupation, showing Japanese women patients recovering in American hospitals. Censored once for morale, such images now served reconstruction. They told the populace that aid, not annihilation, awaited them. For the returning female officers, adjustment was far more complex. In Japan's ruined ports, they disembarked to a homeland changed beyond recognition. Bombed cities, widowed families, hungry faces, no familiar hierarchy remained. Many concealed their service, fearing stigma. Some hid the truth that they had been captured. Others could not explain what they had experienced without betraying the language of their own indoctrination. Yet their silence did not erase their significance. Many resumed medical work, this time under the guidance of American public health advisors reconstructing Japan's nursing system. They found themselves teaching techniques learned from Allied nurses and male medics: sterilization, triage, record-keeping. A cultural circle had closed. What began as humiliation in Luzon became foundation in post-war Tokyo. The same doctors who once treated them were now part of the teams designing Japan's health administration. Under the Allied Civil Information and Education section, reports from 1946 showed Japanese and American staff working elbow to elbow in Tokyo's surviving hospitals, implementing new standards of hygiene and coeducation. Behind the statistics, vaccination drives, reduced mortality rates, and stood the human memory of those wartime wards where equality had been accidental but real. Symbolic moment occurred in 1947, when Japan's reorganized Ministry of Health acknowledged the introduction of male nurses into civilian training, AIC, direct echo of the Allied model. The concept, alien before 1945, entered Japanese vocabulary simply as kangoshi, a gender-neutral term. A transformation seeded in field hospitals had entered law. For the veterans of the old imperial nursing service, recognition came quietly decades later. Oral histories collected in the 1970s reveal a mix of pride and melancholy. One woman recalled, "When the American nurse held my hand, I thought my country was gone. Now I think she handed me a new one." Her words carried the moral equilibrium that post-war Japan would spend decades pursuing, between remembrance and renewal. On the Allied side, former medics seldom forgot the faces of those they tended. When reunions of Pacific veterans took place in the 1960s, some spoke of the Japanese women patients as their most human memories of the war. One referred to that strange season as our apprenticeship in peace. In the photographs preserved by families, you can still see the contrast: khaki uniforms beside white coats, exhaustion balanced by tentative smiles. The decisive turning point, the true climax of this story, was not the signature on surrender papers, but the unspoken exchange between wounded and healer. In those small antiseptic spaces, history reversed itself. The victors learned humility through service. The defeated discovered freedom through weakness, and when the ships finally sailed out toward a silent horizon, they left behind something rarer than victory: understanding. From that understanding would grow the shape of post-war Japan itself: egalitarian, pragmatic, and willing to rebuild from compassion rather than command. In the ruins of empire, the human spirit had found a new discipline: empathy. Its first lesson would unfold in the months that followed. As surrender hardened into reconstruction and mercy became national policy, by early 1946, Japan's acrid smoke had thinned into the smell of plaster dust and wet concrete. Beneath skeletal buildings, hospitals re-emerged from ruins, often nothing more than intact basements outfitted with scavenged beds and lanterns. In these fragile sanctuaries, the echoes of those wartime wards in Luzon and Borneo resurfaced not as nightmares but as blueprints. Occupation authorities understood that public health would become the moral frontier of reconstruction. Under General MacArthur's Civil Information and Education section, American doctors and Japanese reformers built a partnership that mirrored the quiet collaboration once seen between field medics and their former enemies. Female physicians, long marginalized by the imperial system, were invited into leading roles. So were men in nursing, a concept born from those extraordinary encounters abroad. Official directives from 1946 describe medicine as a profession of equal duty. School curricula changed accordingly. Nursing schools reopened as co-educational institutions. Manuals were translated from English into a new technical Japanese vocabulary that quietly erased the old division of gender. The term kangoshi, a neutral form meaning nurse applicable to both men and women, entered law and everyday speech that year. Modern Japan's healthcare language still bears that mark. For the Japanese female officers returning from overseas captivity, rehabilitation was mostly private. They came home to an uneasy society. Veterans viewed with pity women with suspicion. Some concealed their service. Others volunteered in new hospitals staffed jointly with Allied personnel, preferring continuity of duty to reflection. Their silence became its own resilience. Patients under occupation rarely asked whether their caretakers had once worn khaki. Wounds were too numerous for politics. Those who resumed work found irony in their second careers. Western methods, aseptic techniques, patient charts, anesthesia procedures, were now official norms, replacing the imperial field practices they had known. Former prisoners instructed new recruits using English manuals issued by occupation offices. When asked how they acquired such knowledge, they answered indirectly, "We had good teachers long ago, under different circumstances." For women's rights advocates emerging amid Japan's democratic rebirth, their story symbolized broader transformation. The new Constitution of 1947, drafted under Allied supervision, enshrined gender equality explicitly. Behind that legal language lay countless unrecorded gestures that had already normalized cooperation across gender lines in hospitals from Manila to Osaka. American advisors recognized this continuity. Colonel Crawford F. Sams, head of the Public Health and Welfare Section, remarked later that the Japanese acceptance of co-ed medical work was surprisingly rapid, adding in memoirs that combat experience had prepared them better for modern medicine than civilian conservatism ever could. Few realized that he was describing women who had quietly adapted to male nurses months before the surrender. In rural communities, Red Cross campaigns led by Japanese women broadened the meaning of service. Rather than duty to the emperor, it was now duty to the neighbor. Vaccination drives against typhus and dysentery reached villages that had never seen organized healthcare. Photographs from 1948 show female nurses, some former military, administering shots while young men assist them, equal partners beneath a banner reading, "For the health of a peaceful nation." Society itself was relearning care. Newspapers printed features about neighborhood hospitals run jointly by men and women. The idea provoked curiosity rather than outrage. Within a few years, modesty codes that had restricted medical contact between genders faded from professional manuals. Yet among the older generation of nurses, private conflicts persisted. Diaries recovered decades later reveal guilt for surviving captivity while comrades died, confusion over gratitude felt toward former enemies, and pride that their ultimate fidelity to healing had outlived the state that mobilized them. Beneath restraint lay realization. Saving life had eclipsed serving ideology. These quiet personal reconciliations unfolded parallel to national recovery. In a Japan struggling with hunger, inflation, and dislocation, hospitals became symbols of order restored, of civility reborn through science rather than obedience. That fragile but enduring metamorphosis was only the beginning. The material reconstruction of post-war Japan soon intertwined with psychological rebuilding, and the line between healer and healed blurred again. A continuation of the same lesson first learned in captivity. By the late 1940s, the once impossible image of a Japanese woman being treated by a male nurse no longer caused alarm. In the newly rebuilt hospitals of Tokyo, Osaka, and Hiroshima, such scenes had become ordinary life. Students of both genders studied, side by side under chalk-streaked blackboards, labeled Public Health for a Democratic Society. The idea planted in Luzon's humid wards had matured into policy across an entire nation. The U.S. occupation, government measured progress in sanitary data and mortality rates. But to Japanese citizens, these reforms meant something deeper: dignity without hierarchy. Health workers discovered that compassion could thrive without the moral scaffolding of imperial virtue. Female nurses, once punished for showing vulnerability, now learned to value empathy as professionalism. not weakness. Male nurses, borrowed at first from occupation forces, trained successors who would staff schools and municipalities. By 1950, the Public Health Nursing Association of Japan listed over 40% of its members as men, a figure that astonished observers who remembered the rigid morality of the pre-war era. In interviews years later, some of those pioneers credited their awareness not to textbooks but to memory of the post-surrender chaos. A human body, one said simply, bleeds the same color even for an enemy. The cultural transformation went beyond medicine. The experience of women officers and nurses exposed to Allied humanitarianism catalyzed debate about women's broader place in society. In 1948, the government passed the Eugenic Protection Law and the Public Health Nurses Law, both drafted with direct input from Japanese women who had served overseas and understood the administrative needs firsthand. Their presence as policymakers was unprecedented. Meanwhile, occupation authorities used education campaigns to redefine cleanliness and care as civic, not military virtues. Newspapers published layouts of makeshift wards evolving into modern clinics, anchored by a new symbolism, the white cross instead of the red sun. It was propaganda of an entirely different kind, and the Japanese public accepted it without resistance. Among survivors of the wartime wards, assimilation into peace was gradual. Some emigrated to work in labs abroad. Others disappeared into domestic life, their stories known only to family. In interviews conducted in the 1970s by Japan's Health Science Council, several surviving nurses finally spoke openly. Their testimonies shared a tone of quiet reconciliation, disbelief at their initial fear of male nurses, and gratitude that kindness survived where ideology failed. One recalled an American medic humming while cleaning her wound, a simple tune with no lyrics. "I thought then," she said, "if this is the enemy, what have we been fighting?" That sentence, more than any treaty, measured the distance between the war's rhetoric and its human reality. In the larger geopolitical narrative, these individual changes were eclipsed by the Cold War, the Korean War, and Japan's industrial rise. Yet the ethical foundations laid in those hospital wards endured. They informed Japan's commitment to international medical aid in later decades, its early participation in World Health Organization projects, its dispatch of doctors to Southeast Asia, its reputation for disciplined but humane care. Every modern exchange of Japanese humanitarian missions abroad carries an echo of that evolution from isolation to empathy. Back at home, annual commemorations of wartime nurses now include both genders. Memorial services at temples and universities honor compassion as service, not subservience. Visitors stand before stone monuments inscribed with a simple phrase, "To those who healed in all uniforms." The story's final paradox lies in its beginning, that the path to Japan's modern identity, a society blending duty and democracy, began in defeat and depended on mercy from former enemies. What was once an unthinkable sight, Japanese women officers accepting care from male nurses, became both a historical fact and a national metaphor. It told future generations that strength wears many faces, and sometimes the one that saves you is the one you were taught to fear. 3 years after surrender, with the nation rebuilt and the world moving toward new conflicts, Japan's hospitals stood as quiet triumphs over ideology, places where humanity, stripped bare by war, had learned again how to breathe, heal, and trust. That enduring lesson forms the last chapter of this story. In war, nations measure victory by territory gained or enemies defeated. History's quieter accounting is more precise. It counts the moments when hostility yielded to humanity. The episode of the Japanese women officers and the male nurses who treated them belongs to that ledger. For centuries, Japan's ideal woman had stood behind partitions of obedience, her virtue defined by restraint. The war exploded those walls, exposing devotion itself to hunger, pain, and disillusion. Yet only through collapse could a truer strength emerge. When those women accepted care from foreign men, they crossed the last forbidden threshold of their world. In doing so, they unknowingly ushered in a modern one. Their story is not about humiliation. It is about equilibrium found through reversal. The conqueror offered tenderness, the defeated accepted it, and in that exchange a civilization recalibrated its conscience. The battlefield had taught efficiency and destruction. The ward taught mastery and compassion. Every new hospital built in post-war Japan bore that inheritance. Each sterilized instrument, each shared classroom, each handshake across language lines carried the proof that dignity thrives when pride is gone. The Mustangs that once rained fire over Tokyo would give way to medical airlifts, vaccines, and relief flights. The same impulse to reach farther than thought possible survived, redirected toward preservation rather than domination. Today, when Japanese humanitarian teams respond to disasters around the world, their creed descends from those first unsteady interactions in 1945. Where ideology once forbade contact, medicine now insists on it. The mercy learned from defeat became the foundation of Japan's international compassion. The image endures. A dim ward in the tropics. A woman once sworn to die for her emperor leaning into the steady hands of a man sent to conquer her nation. In that simple act of care, centuries of distance close to a breath. Beyond uniforms, beyond language, the lesson remains the same. Sometimes the truest victory is to heal the very enemy who taught you what compassion means.